Hello, Biblical Classical community. Thanks for joining me again for another lesson in narrative writing. Today is lesson 2, the basic narrative paragraph, and I'm going to be talking about the elements of a narrative. So last week we talked about how God wrote the greatest story ever told, and the Bible is the best example of writing. Our writing should reflect his truth. Well, today's principle that we're going to start with is God's stories give us hope. He used stories to move our hearts with love and power. Jesus's stories teach us truth. He used stories to get us to think about the meaning of life. And I love here how our lesson starts with what is on God's mind and how does it relate to what we're doing today. So what we're going to focus on is the leading idea. Stories have structure. They are more impactful when their structure is clear, their characters are well defined, their setting is described in detail, their plot is relatable, and their theme is meaningful. So we'll be talking about what the exact structure of a paragraph should be when you're writing a narrative. Let's start off with the research and reason part of our assignment. You're going to look up the Bible verses that I have written here in the NIRV version of the Bible, and you can always search that online if you don't have an NIRV. The NIRV is the New International Reader's Version. So it's a child's version that's easy to read, and I hope you enjoy that particular version of the Bible. So you're going to look up Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 6, and you're going to answer the question, what do you have to understand stories? Then you're going to look up Matthew 13 and read verses 1 through 11 and answer the question, why did Jesus use stories or parables? Then you're going to look up the following words in Webster's 1828 dictionary. Again, you can get that online if you don't have a copy of your own. And you're going to write a short version of the definitions for each. And those words are wise and parable. Then you're going to review the elements of a narrative graphic like we did last week. And you want to remind yourself what the elements of a narrative are. A narrative should have character, setting, plot, point of view, theme, and style. And if you forgot what those are, you can check back on lesson 1. And don't forget the introduction sentence frames when writing your story. You can start with one day, once upon a time, or in a blank, and you talk about your location and time. Then after you review the elements of a narrative graphic, then you're going to review the basic narrative paragraph graphic. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So the basic narrative paragraph has 3 parts: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. So the introduction starts with the introductory sentence frame that I talked about just a second ago. Once upon a time, or one blank day, or it was a blank day in a blank place when blank characters did something. So something like that where you're using the sentence frames that I provided for you. Also in the introduction, you're going to include a short description of the name or names of the character or characters, what they look like, and what kind of person they are, what their qualities are, or what their talents are. You're also going to include a short description of the setting. That means the location, the time of day, month, season, the year, perhaps. I gave you some examples of what your introduction should look like. The introduction is usually the very first sentence of your paragraph. It could be more than one sentence, but we can start with just the first one. So here are some examples. Once upon a time in the cold mountains of Colorado, a young boy was helping his mother out of the car because she had broken her leg this past winter in a ski accident. So here in this very first sentence, I introduce a lot about the characters. The boy was young. He was helping his mother because she broke her leg in a ski accident. So there's quite a few details there just in that one sentence. And then for the setting, I talk about the state that they're in and what it looks like in their surroundings. Let's go to example number 2. One day, while hiking in the jungles of Africa on a hot summer day, Ashlyn saw an injured rabbit on the ground. So here I'm talking about the country of Africa and that it's a jungle and it's hot and it's the summer and it's during the day and not at night. I introduce the characters and a little bit of what the action is. My third example says, it was a cool, crisp morning on the yacht near the shore of the Gulf of Mexico when Max and Randy thought of a great business idea. Their whole life, they had dreamed of starting their own business. Now that they were living on their own, they could fulfill their dreams. So in this case, we have 3 sentences for our introduction. We talk about what it was like. It's not day, it's not night, it's morning, and it's cool and crisp. It's not hot. They're on a yacht near the shore in the Gulf of Mexico, so they're in this beach setting. And I introduce the characters, Max and Randy, and a little bit about what they're doing. But I also go into a little bit more detail about who these characters are and what's going on in their mind. Now let's move on to the second part of our basic narrative paragraph, and that is part 2, the body. This is going to be the bulk or the major part of your story. So the first point I want to make is that the first part of the plot or event may have already been mentioned in the introduction, but the body of the narrative is where you develop the plot, giving careful thought into what is going to happen and how the plot will resolve a problem or challenge. Here is an example. It was a cool, crisp morning in the early spring on the yacht near the shore of the Gulf of Mexico when Max and Randy thought of a great business idea. They wanted to give tours of the shore and give customers a memorable experience with several water excursions. The first thing they decided to do was see if they could get an investor to help pay for a boat and advertising. Next, they both brainstormed ideas for explaining their business to investors and shared it with several people. More and more people seemed interested, but no one wanted to make a commitment for several months. Discouragement came over both of them, but they never gave up. Here in this example, I started with my introduction, but also continued with the body. The main points in my body are they wanted to give different types of tours, but they needed a boat. So they had to find an investor to help pay for a boat. Then they had to come up with ideas on how to get an investor. People were interested, but no one made a commitment. And the last part of the point, which is the problem, discouragement came over both of them. So here we have the main problem. So I introduced the problem with telling you the different factors that led to the problem. Let's look at point number 3 on the graphic here. The body of a narrative has a beginning and middle. A problem has been established using several sentences that outline the different parts of the plot. And that's what you're going to do in your story. Think about the 2 or 3, maybe 4 things that lead to the problem. Okay, now we're going to talk about part 3 of the narrative paragraph, which is the conclusion. The conclusion gives a closing to the challenge or problem. And here's my example from Max and Randy's story. After waiting 6 months and giving many more presentations, they finally found an investor who not only gave them enough money for a boat and advertising, but also gave them the advice they needed. So in this conclusion, you're going to include the time period. So how much time passed to come to the solution? You're going to include what that solution is, and you're going to add details other than the basic idea that there was a solution. And finally, you're going to use 1 to 3 sentences for your conclusion. And that's it for the basic narrative paragraph. You have the introduction, which is about 1 or 2 sentences. Then you have the body, where you're going to give more of the details of the plot and the action that's happening, including and leading up to a particular problem. And then your conclusion, which is 1 to 3 sentences, where you explain how the problem was solved. Now let's go back to my lesson. So we reviewed the basic narrative paragraph graphic, and you're going to go ahead and do that on your own so that you understand it also. And you're going to try to recite all the elements of a narrative without looking. And by this time, you should know that the 6 elements of a narrative, meaning what a narrative has to have to be a narrative, should be character, setting, plot, point of view, theme, and style. So your assignment for the week is to write your own story with 8 to 14 sentences, similar to the story of the farmer Jesus talked about from Matthew 13, verses 3 through 8. You're going to create a problem and an ending that shows the results of a wise person who is able to solve the problem. Plan the names and descriptions of 1 or 2 characters, the location and time of year or day, and the main events in your story. You can have people or animals as characters. In Jesus's parable, there was the farmer and a bird. The bird was not the only problem. The ground was also a problem. So you can include multiple parts to your problem or the problem in your story to make it more interesting. When you're finished, you're going to use the writing quality checklist and make sure that you have as many qualities as possible. And again, I did not cover everything on that checklist. It's still good to use it and get used to it so that once I get to that part of the course, you'll be familiar with it. So now let me talk about the different parts of this particular lesson. Lesson 2 assignment can be found in the assignments packet in the welcome section. I review what the biblical principle and leading idea is, and then give you space to write your answers to the questions from the scriptures, a short definition of the vocabulary words that I asked you to look up in the 1828 dictionary, and write down what the parts of a narrative are here in this section or on your paper. And then you're going to use this bottom section just to jot down what story ideas you might be thinking of. You might have just one idea in your head. You might have several. It could be a story that's fake or something that happened to you or something that happened to someone else. It could be whatever story you want it to be, but you want it to have a problem similar to the one from Matthew 13 and conclude it with the solution. You could also use the basic narrative paragraph example that is in the handouts. And I basically explained the same thing that I talked to you about today, what I did in the introduction. I have my comments on the right-hand side, what I did for the body and what I did for the conclusion. And you can use that as a guide. If you would like an electronic version using Google Slides of the assignment, I can provide that for you also. It has the lesson that I talked about, the graphic for the elements of a narrative, the basic narrative paragraph, the example paragraph, your lesson 2 assignment where you're going to answer the questions, the weekly writing assignment where you're going to put in what the character setting and plot is for your story after you've thought of some ideas, and then the checklist that you can use to drag your X's to the right box. You can also put your name and title on this. As I talked about in lesson 1, I provided for you a place to do your writing. So that's available if you'd like. And that's it for lesson 2, the basic narrative paragraph. Just to review, God's stories give us hope, and they teach us truth and help us to think about the meaning of life. So if you could write a story that teaches truth, talks about the meaning of life, is something that gives us hope, then you're going to be well on your way to being a great writer for narrative writing. All you have to do is use the structure that I provided for you on the basic narrative paragraph and do your best. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in lesson 3.